Mehmet's 2006 or 2007. He did a study with what is called like gifted people, so people who have an IQ over 130. IQ, for those of you who might not be familiar with, is intelligent coefficient. So, and what he found actually is that even though this gifted people, these people who had an intelligence, and it was not a specific intelligence, it was a IQ, like a normal IQ test, let's say this conventional intelligence. Even though that indeed at early stages of their careers, let's say of their practice, they were more creative than their peers, than teammates. Over time, the peers caught up with it. So then it didn't really make that much of a difference, which is also builds on this idea of non-linearity of the development, and why it is important really that academies have a bit of patience. This is a bit like the maturation discussion, you know. Some people will mature later than others, but there's a problem here. Well, like with a maturation, for example, you might have heard of something called the relative age effect, what has to do with maturation, which is usually the players who are born in the first couple of months of the year, or depending on where the registration period for new players are. But the players who are born in earlier months of the year have an advantage over, or are usually selected first than the players who are selected who are born in the later registration stages, because they tend to develop faster, and because coaches tend to like players who develop faster, because they usually are able to do things at least better in the short term. Then we enter a bit of a vicious cycle, because then they get better training, and then it's almost like what we say in English, a self-fulfilling prophecy, that because they get better training, then they get better than the others. So the gap ends up widening, and that's a bit of the danger with that gifted idea. And I think, even though I don't agree with a lot of the things that Mehmet writes, I think that study is really important in the sense that he shows that over time, actually, things level. So giftedness might not be that important for creativity. And the other thing I forgot to say is that most of the studies of creativity, like most of the studies in sport, are done with either like university students, or with like physical education with children. There's not a lot of stuff done with kind of elite athletes or people who are recognized as being of the top of the game. So it's also important when we draw our conclusions that we also, it's usually the part that everyone skips, the part of when you read a research paper of the method. But I think, like what I was saying a few minutes ago, it's really important that you are critical in the sense of understanding how these guys, or even myself in my studies, how you come to the conclusions, what you did in order to understand if the conclusions make sense or not. There was a lot of discussion. There's this perception that there are fewer creative players in youth football nowadays. And the scout of this academy that I went to, the head of scouting, was saying this, today, that the players look more equal. And that he justifies with the fact that they don't play on, not only on the street, but everything they do is kind of supervised by adults, because of always this kind of instruction: play one touch, play two touches, do this, do that, and that prevents players from exploring themselves. And this is where the constraints-led approach, the Fradilha's idea of giving birth to the context instead of the behavior, of focusing too much on the behaviors. And this is another relationship with creativity. Curiously, he says there may be fewer bad players, because of this idea of the football schools, of this idea of teaching creativity or teaching football, like the football schools that have been, it's like mushrooms everywhere. But that also means that there are fewer very good players or very creative players, at least in the perspective of this set of scouting of the with the under 13 team, which is quite an interesting one, because Mehmet says that that's kind of a sensitive period for creativity. Until 13, it's important to develop it. It doesn't mean that it cannot be developed after, but players are a bit more like sponges, and they are building their kind of personality. They're a bit more open for change or for experiences up to that age. And this is why I was particularly interested on under 13. So I focused a lot on them. Generally, they were quite passionate, quite happy. Even though we stayed at street football, this idea that street football doesn't exist anymore, that kids are all sat in the house playing computer games, whatever. Actually, they spent a lot of time playing outside, but also because they had available facilities to do so. Like in Portugal, we have quite a lot of outdoors council facilities that you can access for free, which is something that, for example, in Scotland is not so common. So that's something already important. It's a constraint, for creativity. Interestingly, as well, players reported watching really a lot of matches on TV, and they tend to focus on the players on their position. Like, let's say if you're a fullback, you would look into Marcelo. If you're a centre back, you would look into Sergio Ramos or whatever, and then they said that YouTube is it's their main source of inspiration for tricks and skills. So actually, the fact that they are online, that they have this things available, the internet is not necessarily only bad for creativity. It can also be a source of inspiration for them. In terms of the team level, I actually found a lot of good stuff being done, being organized by the coaches. They had two coaches, an older coach who used to be a player and not to a top level. He was professional with the club, but not to a really, really, really high level. He had then left because of an injury and he went to study. He's a physical education teacher and a part-time coach with under 13s. He was the head coach. And then we had a 26-year-old assistant coach, just fresh out of university, who really wants to climb the ladder. And they had a bit of this good cop, bad cop approach, in which the head coach was a nice guy, very supportive of the players, trying always to make them confident. And the bad cop was the assistant coach, who was very rigorous in terms of the tactical behaviors, of the positioning of the players. And actually, I found that it works really, really well. Approach was quite good. Like what Vuder was talking about, the divergent convergent thinking. So for me, it was further evidence, let's say, that's both the combination of both work quite well, because the days when there was only one coach there, depending on who it was, actually things didn't work so well. The coaches were spot on in terms of what the research says. Little interference. They planned the training in order for not to have to say a lot. The context spoke for itself, and they were always like telling players to take risks, what we call in English banter. They were teasing them, or you're the worst player here, you cannot do this, you cannot do that, but in a really like cheery, funny way.